Okay, the book of 2 Thessalonians.
Great.
Same thing. Paul writing to the church in Thessalonica, and it's written pretty soon after the first letter. Pretty much an immediate follow-up after that first one, because all the stuff he wrote about in the first letter got worse. The suffering got worse. They had even more questions about the second coming. I mean, all of the themes from 1 Thessalonians are revisited because the Christians there in Thessalonica, the situation has gotten worse even since the first letter. So here's the thesis for 2 Thessalonians. It's that the second coming of Christ is what gives us the hope to endure suffering in this life, and it's what gives us the ability to continue working for Christ even in the midst of suffering.
Yep.
So very similar to the first one, where the second coming is still the underlying theme, but in this book, the suffering has been amped up. The persecution has been amped up on the Thessalonians, which Paul kind of knew would happen. He was hinting at it in the first letter. It's happened. And that is the first big theme I'll mention, just as persecution and judgment. In the first letter, Paul doesn't quite get into as much of the judgment that's going to come, but here Paul is clear. One of our hopes in our life as Christians, when we are facing suffering and persecution, is that God will make it right and will punish those who persecute us. Mm-hmm. How on earth can Christian martyrs endure martyrdom? It's because they know vengeance is the Lord's and that he is perfectly just and he will repay evildoers. And so Paul is calling the Thessalonians to cling to that hope. As the persecution ramps up, God sees it, God knows he's going to come and bring justice on that when he comes again soon. Yeah. Another theme, again, the second coming, Paul gives us more insight into what's going to happen around the second coming. First letter, it was, what's going to happen? He's going to descend. When's it going to happen? Like a thief in the night. Well, here we go again. What's happened in between the first letter and the second letter is somebody has been spreading a false teaching that the second coming already happened. Mm-hmm. And now these young, new Christians are freaking out. Wait, it already happened? We got left behind? They're worried that they've missed it somehow, that they somehow messed it up and they didn't get brought. Something's gone wrong. The second coming's already happened. Paul, in the first letter, just has this very, fatherly tone. He clearly loves the Thessalonians. He's a little sharper with them in the second letter. Guys, I told you about the second coming. How could you believe that it already happened? Didn't you read my first letter? Don't you remember what I told you? So he goes, all right, again, don't believe anything people tell you. Believe what I told you. And here's some more info about it. You definitely haven't missed it. Why? Because he talks about there's things that have to happen first. Namely, there's a rebellion, Paul says. There's going to be a rebellion that happens first. And there's going to be a man of lawlessness. Typically, we say that this is the Antichrist that we see in other places in Scripture. All Paul calls him here is the man of lawlessness. Mm-hmm. He's going to come, and then Jesus is going to appear, and all Jesus does is breathe, and the man of lawlessness is done. Mm-hmm. He appears, breathes, that guy's gone. But that guy has to come first before Christ can come. So he's reassuring them, you guys haven't missed it. You'll know. And the big theme is it's impossible to miss the second coming. Nobody's going to miss it. If anybody comes and tells you, I've had this happen. I've run into people from cults who are like, yeah, Jesus returned in 19 whatever. And I'm like, he definitely didn't, man. He definitely didn't. Because everybody's going to know when it happens. It's going to be unmistakable.
Yeah.
So a related theme to that is that he's telling the Thessalonians to stick to Scripture. Multiple times he says, guys, I gave you the correct traditions. I've been writing you letters. Stick to what I said. Stick to the tradition that's been passed down from the apostles, and you can't go wrong. Once you start listening to other stuff that's not the tradition we passed down to you, you're going to be in trouble. Stick to Scripture is what he's saying. One last theme that has carried over from 1 Thessalonians but gotten way worse is the theme of idleness. Mentioned briefly in the first letter, here Paul goes in. Again, the first letter, much more like, you guys are doing great. I love you guys. This letter, hey, wait a minute. What are you guys doing? I said don't be idle.
Yeah.
A lot of people think it's probably because of the whole second coming misunderstanding. They're like, we missed it, or it's about to come soon, so we don't need to work or whatever, this type of thing. But there are basically people in the church there who are living off of other people at the church, the generosity of others in the church, in a way that they should not be, and they're not working as they should be. And so Paul says, guys, you need to get to work. He reminds them of the example he set. I worked the whole time I was with you. I didn't ask for any money. I worked to set an example for what you should do, which is work. And he also ties this into the second coming. He kind of ties it into, guys, you abandoned what I told you about the second coming, and then you also abandon the things you're supposed to be doing, and you're idle. And they're connected. What you're believing, whether you're sticking to the tradition, whether you're believing what I've told you, impacts what you're doing. And all of this is tied together. And now one of the main things you're doing is not working. You need to work and provide for yourself and work for the Lord. So that's a big theme, and a much bigger theme in the second letter than the first. Okay, here's some tips. Anytime we get to passages talking about the second coming, people start to, it's confusing, we want to,
Sure.
We're like, oh man, what do you mean the man of lawlessness? We get into it. And it's just stuff that's confusing and unclear. And anytime we get to the end times, it's like that on purpose in one sense, like we're just not going to know until it happens, some of the details. But there's two threads for us to track down, I think, in this book that'll be helpful as a tip for reading it. First one, I noticed this. You might have something to add to this, Lucas, since I know you've thought about it recently. But in chapter 1, verse 9, it says that those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of Jesus will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction. And there are some who take that verse to mean eternal destruction means that all these people who are God's coming back, these wraths on them, they just get destroyed. There's no kind of eternal conscious torment in hell. They just kind of, they're out of existence. And they go, see, eternal destruction. Not eternal torment, destruction. So there's a couple other places you can go in Scripture to think about that, but the main one I would say to go to is Revelation 14, where it talks about the second coming and those who go towards this destruction.
Right.
And we went through this when we preached through Revelation, but the smoke of those who are tormented goes up forever. And it's really hard to get around the idea in that passage that for there to be smoke, somebody has to be being tormented. If the torment's causing the smoke, that means the torment's forever.
Right.
There are many other passages to go to as well. That's probably the clearest one.
Because that one also says they don't experience any break from the torment, day or night.
Yeah, a break like a destruction. Right.
Yeah, they don't experience rest. There's no rest from the torment. They would say, eternal destruction means that the destruction happens, and for all eternity you can't take it back. Right. Versus destruction that eternally endures, which I think is the traditional understanding of it.
That just stood out to me as I was reading 2 Thessalonians. I go, that could be confusing. Again, a lot of this end time stuff. You go, what does he mean by that? And it takes some digging through the rest of Scripture to sometimes put all the pieces together. Same for this next piece about the man of lawlessness. Mm-hmm. There are passages about the Antichrist. There's a lot, there's the beast, there's all this stuff. You can go and put all the passages together. I just want to point out one passage, since Paul doesn't use the term Antichrist here. The term man of lawlessness, I think, is picking up on a theme from the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel, much more confusing than 2 Thessalonians. But in chapter 11 of the book of Daniel, it mentions a man of lawlessness, and Paul specifically uses the terminology from that chapter in 2 Thessalonians 2. So if you want to understand, Paul's just not making this up out of nowhere, and potentially the Thessalonians even could have figured it out themselves. Again, they're younger Christians, so maybe they're not, and they're Gentiles also, so they're probably not up on Daniel. But he's getting this from Daniel. He's showing them, guys, we've known since Daniel that there has to be this guy who comes first before the second. That's a signifier of the end. So that's just one place to look to start digging into the man of lawlessness. You could go down on a long rabbit hole about it, but at least look at Daniel and see how Paul is drawing on that to talk about this end times, what's going to happen before the end.
Right.
Jesus also, in I believe Matthew 24 mentions Daniel and the abomination of desolation. Similar theme. They're not talking about Antichrist. They're talking about this lawless, sinful, evil, abominable man who will come, which is really, is
Many
the Antichrist also.
Equate with the Antichrist.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
But just as far as the man of lawlessness specifically, that is also kind of another theme that Antichrist gets folded into. Obviously, Antichrist becomes more of a theme in the New Testament after Christ has come versus in the Old Testament.
Yep.
Last tip, much quicker than the others. The chapter and verse numbers in the Bible are not inspired. They weren't written there by Paul. He didn't write these chapter and verse numbers. So it's a good practice when you're reading to kind of ignore those and split the text where you think Paul's splitting the text. Like just because the ESV translators put a break there doesn't mean that Paul would have put a break there.
Sure.
However, in 2 Thessalonians, I think the themes of the book line up really neatly with the chapters. It just happens to be that way in 2 Thessalonians. So as a tip for reading it, chapter 1 kind of has a theme, chapter 2 has a theme, chapter 3 has a theme. And that will help you reading the book. It just happens to work out this way in this case. So it's nice for reading. You go, okay, 1 is about this, 2 is about this, 3 is about this. So you can look out for that as you're reading the book.
Nice.
Okay, ties to Christ. Again, very similar to 1 Thessalonians. Christ is going to come back. He's going to come back. Mm-hmm. You won't be able to miss it. And one thing that I think 2 Thessalonians makes clear is that the wrath, it's not like Jesus is the guy who saves us and then God comes and brings wrath. Jesus is the one who brings the wrath at the end. Jesus is the one who puts down the persecutors and the ones who are harming his people. So as far as a tie to Christ, who he is, his character, his attributes, wrath is one of Christ's attributes as well. Mm-hmm. It's not like he's the nice one in God. It's not bad cop, good cop, bad cop. Right. It's Christ comes back with wrath for sin and for those who have persecuted his church. And the gospel is the only way. Again, those who don't obey the gospel have the wrath, not just the persecutors. The gospel is the only way to be spared from that wrath. Yeah. Okay, so takeaways from this book. Again, similar to the first one, but endure suffering with hope for the second coming. That's how you are able to endure suffering. If you ever read the stories of martyrs in history or martyrs in the Bible and wonder, could I do that? Would I be able to do that? If push came to shove and the fiery furnace was there, would I not bow down? One way to work on knowing that you wouldn't bow down, one way to fortify yourself, prepare yourself for that moment, to be able to survive that moment, is to hope in the second coming. That's Paul's point in 2 Thessalonians. It's that hope of Christ returning with vengeance that enables us to actually survive those scenarios, if they were to come in our life. Likely none of us in America will face that, but that is a legitimate question to ask as you read this. Right. Man, would I be able to do that? Well, how much are you hoping for Christ to return? How much are you clinging to the fact that he's going to come again one day and make things right? That's going to help you in that scenario.
Yeah.
Cling to the scriptures and don't get caught up in all kinds of doomsday prophesying, internet prophets, predictions of the end of the world. That's what the Thessalonians were doing. This guy was like, you guys missed it. He already came. And they're freaking out. We can do that today so easily, man. It's everywhere, this kind of end of the world, end times prophesying stuff. Cling to what Scripture clearly says about what's going to happen at the end. Don't get caught up in myths and other things about the end times that we don't know about, that people are just making up. Does it align with Scripture? What does Scripture say about the end? Cling to that. And finally, get to work. Mm-hmm. Get to work. Don't use Christ's second coming as an excuse not to work. Use it as a reason to work. Let him come back and find you working for him when he returns.
And when you mean work, how do you mean work? Unpack that just real quick.
It means literal work.
Right.
Don't just...
At least means that.
Don't just...
So take care of home, take care of family.
Exactly.
Right? Or don't bum off of everybody else.
Yep.
And then are there themes in 2 Thessalonians that is beyond that as well, or is it kind of focused on vocational kind of work?
It's mostly focused on vocational kind of work. I should say, I'll put it like this: get to work and persevere in your faith would be the flip side of it that Thessalonians is talking about. Yeah. It is getting to work for Christ. He puts it as persevering for Christ, or enduring for Christ.
Yep.
Which you could say is working for Christ, doing things for Him.
Sure.
So don't be idle and lazy. Support yourself.
Yep.
Do the things you're supposed to do in that way. And then persevere and endure in your faith.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks.